All right, we are in week 7. We're rolling along in the semester. We're halfway done. So, last week we looked at deviance in sports, which is a broad topic, and I feel like when we see a lot in the news, and it can encompass a variety of behaviors in sports. So, things like drug use, cheating, arrests, which for the most part we consider deviant under conformity. That is, we're doing something that we shouldn't, and it goes against the laws and norms of our society. And we contrasted this with deviant overconformity, in which we follow our desire and discipline to be the best so much that we end up breaking those laws and norms to do so. And so deviant overconformity might be done consciously and purposefully, such as taking PEDs to be a better athlete, or it might happen through coercion or abuse, such as athletes submitting to a coach who pressures them into doing something that's not right. And we have certainly seen some terrible scandals in the last few years, especially with some sexual abuse, like with USA Gymnastics and on some college campuses. So we can blame that a little bit on our desire to be the best, so much so that we're going to follow the orders of somebody that we think we should, and they end up hurting us. So that's one of the ideas behind deviant overconformity. In your discussion questions, one of the things that I asked for was to pick an act of deviance and do a little research, such as whether that behavior was more prevalent in the general population or more prevalent among athletes. And an example of what I was looking for there is something like drug use. So let's take things like marijuana, for example. I found a study that the NCAA published that looked at alcohol and drug use of some various substances among NCAA athletes versus the general regular population. And so let's take marijuana, for example. They found that 25% of NCAA athletes had used marijuana in the last year, compared to 33% of the general population. So in that case, that particular drug use was lower than the general population. Getting into a little bit of a harder drug, they found that 4% of NCAA athletes reported using cocaine in the last year, which was the same percentage as those who reported using it in the general population. Again, it was 4% of the general population reported using cocaine last year. So in that case, athletes use cocaine at the same rate as the general population. So often in sports, I wanted us to look at that because so often in sports we see high profile cases of deviant acts like drug use or cheating or violent crimes or sex crimes. So do we perceive athletes as having more deviance just because those occurrences are in the news more? They're scandals. They're in the news. If I did something bad, it probably wouldn't make the news. So I wanted to kind of just illustrate that it's important to check facts before we assume, for example, that NFL players have higher arrest rates than the general population. In fact, they don't. And that's a statistic that one of you pointed out in your discussion questions this week, and that was a very good one. I appreciated kind of that education as far as arrest rates of the NFL versus the general population. It's important that we don't stereotype certain groups just based on high profile cases that we see in the news, because those make the news. So that was this past week. This week, we're looking at gender, sexuality, and sport. And we've got a few different topics here. First of all, I want us to learn a little bit about Title IX. And mainly, I just want to educate you on what Title IX is so that you can talk about it correctly and so that you have a correct understanding of what it is. It's a very common misperception. Often I have students tell me that Title IX requires the number of men's sports and women's sports to be equal. And that's not the case. Please don't ever say that in an assignment with me. So it's not an equal number of men's and women's sports. That's an oversimplification of what Title IX requires. Title IX requires the number of opportunities to be proportionate to the enrollment of the institution. So that's one thing. It also requires a continual expansion of opportunities for the underrepresented gender. And then third, it requires for schools to do their diligence in trying to accommodate the interests and abilities of the underrepresented gender. So there are kind of three things that Title IX requires. It's not equal opportunities, it's proportional opportunities, and then continued assessment of interests, and then continued expansion for wherever it's underrepresented. And there are lots of small details and regulations in what that looks like. If there were going to be an investigation or something, or criteria to determine if they are providing proportionate opportunities. So anyway, it's just a little bit of an education on what Title IX is and isn't, so that you can kind of have your facts straight if you ever talk about it. We are also going to look at homo and heterosexuality in sports, namely the idea of sports not being as inclusive towards gay men as it has kind of historically been towards gay women, and maybe some ways in which that's changing. And we're going to look at inclusive masculinity theory to kind of help us frame that kind of recent change, and maybe some more inclusivity in men's sports. So that's what we're doing this week. I hope you're having a good week. I hope these topics, what I would love for you to do is to be able to kind of see these topics in the news and think, yeah, we talked about that in class. And, this would be a good example of an issue of deviance, or of an issue of sports and religion, or sports and politics, or, some of the things that we talk about. So thanks for hanging with me. I hope that you guys have a great week.